Okay, well, okay, we're great. We're recording, and we're gonna have captions as well. So, without very much ado, I'm very pleased to introduce Sam Asher, who's a colleague of ours in our hometown here at Hopkins SIS, and we're excited to hear from him about some of his very recent work on urban and rural issues in India. So, Sam, with that, please take it away.
Thanks so much, Austin. It just occurred to me, since we have a relatively small room, and it's always nice to know who you're talking to, do you think we could just quickly go around the room and give like a kind of one line, like, I'm Sam Asher, I'm an assistant professor of economics at SAIS at Johns Hopkins, and it's very nice to be here.
Yeah, great. I'll go ahead and call on people just so that we keep things organized. So David, why don't you go first?
Hi, I'm David Simpson. I'm the Administrative Director for the International Economic Relations, Global Environmental Policy, and International Development Clusters, and I'm an economist.
Adam?
Hey, Sam. Good. Really excited to have you here. Yeah, I'm an assistant professor in SIS, also doing work on sort of issues of urbanization in India. So really excited for this presentation.
Yeah, glad you're here, Adam.
Next I have Aaron.
Hi, just a hanger on from the area that likes to hear these subjects, and I've been to India many times.
Great.
Great, welcome, Aaron. Gabe. Okay, moving on. Greg, would you like to say a word?
Hi, Sam. It's Greg. I'm an assistant professor in the economics department.
Hey, good to see you, Greg.
Jennifer.
Hi, Sam. Nice to meet you. I'm Jennifer. I'm an associate professor with Austin and Stephanie in SIS, also an economist by training. Looking forward to your talk.
Thanks. Likewise. Good to meet you.
Manaswini.
Good morning, Dr. Asher. My name is Manu. I'm a PhD candidate at SIS under Professor Auerbach, and I'm excited to hear about your topic. Thank you.
Great. Nice to meet you, Manaswini.
And lastly, Walter.
Yes, good morning. I'm Walter Park. I'm with the economics department here, and just having a little bit of a late breakfast. So if I could maybe unvideo myself for a while. Thanks. Good to meet you.
Of course.
I won't take offense.
I think that's everyone.
Okay, fantastic. Let's dive right in. Thanks so much for this invitation. I really appreciate it. And yeah, this paper is joint work with Anjali Adukia at the University of Chicago, Kritarth Jha, who's a fantastic research assistant of ours at the Development Data Lab, which is an organization that my co-author Paul Novosad and I started a couple of years ago to kind of handle our work and also both our research and our open science work. Paul Novosad, who's my longtime partner in crime since grad school days, and then Brandon Tan, who's a very talented PhD student at the university at Harvard. Keep an eye out for him. So this is work on segregation, and in particular on whether India's cities, fast urbanizing, fast growing, are reproducing its rural disparities. And here we're going to really zoom down to a very high spatial resolution. In general, my work is high spatial res, but this is even more than normal. We're going to look at over 1 million neighborhoods across India in both rural and urban areas and understand their caste and religious composition, the nature of public goods provision and living standards in these areas. This paper could also be subtitled, Sam Asher tries to figure out how to write a descriptive paper. I don't know about the rest of you, but we were certainly not taught in grad school how to write compelling descriptive papers. Maybe the political scientist in the room can help us out with this. Okay, we've known for a long time that neighborhood, that place, is a really important determinant of economic opportunity. There's a lot of work in particular on the role of neighborhoods in the United States. There's all the work on moving to opportunity. There's lots on segregation. There's much less of this kind of work in developing countries. I would argue in large part due to data limitations. And we're going to try to be overcoming those data limitations in this paper and seeing what we can learn. The context here is, of course, the rapidly urbanizing developing world. In lower income countries, cities are growing at a very, very rapid pace. The growth of megacities has been one particular salient phenomenon. But people generally study this urbanization process at the level of the city or the level of the country. And we think that the neighborhood level characteristics are going to be probably very, very important and not very well understood. And so in this paper, what we're going to do is we're going to create a data set of over 1 million neighborhoods from across India. These are going to be both urban and rural neighborhoods based on essentially census microdata. And I'll talk a bunch about the data that we have. We're going to study the settlement patterns and access to public goods of 2 marginalized communities in India. On the one hand, scheduled castes, and on the other hand, Muslims. And again, I'll talk more about both of these groups and as well as the groups that we're not including here. And we're going to kind of there are many different ways that you could put a frame on this whole paper and the set of results that we're finding. What we think is the sort of most productive for this first descriptive paper that we're writing on segregation and neighborhoods in India is to ask whether rural settlement patterns and the inequalities that we observe in rural areas and that have been studied a lot more than those in urban areas are these being replicated in urban India? And we think this is interesting both because of sort of lack of particularly quantitative evidence on these topics, but also because in the context of these fast-growing cities, there's a lot both to be learned, but also potentially to be changed. Rural areas are going to be a lot harder. They've been settled for millennia in many cases, but in the case of cities, they're being shaped by many active policies right now, from zoning to infrastructure and so on. And so the question is, what are the facts? And maybe at the very end, we can think a little bit about what we can do about the inequalities that we're observing here. And I should say, absolutely feel free to interrupt me. I did my PhD at Harvard at the development lunch there. You don't get past the first slide. I do appreciate getting past the first slide here. But at the same time, I get nervous when I start hearing my own voice for too long. Okay, so as a preview of results, Muslims and scheduled castes are very highly segregated in urban India. They're very highly segregated in rural India as well. We're finding that basically the high levels of segregation that we're seeing in rural areas is almost being precisely replicated in urban neighborhoods. These neighborhoods of marginalized communities are experiencing far worse access to public goods, particularly Muslims. And this is consistent with some other work we're doing, suggesting that Muslims may be India's sort of most marginalized community at this point, that there's been a lot of policy focus and political mobilization for scheduled castes. And we think that some of the catch up that's taking place for scheduled castes and even for scheduled tribes is leaving Muslims behind. This marginalization and this lack of access, yes, go ahead.
Hey, Sam, just a quick question before you go forward. Can you define a little bit more about what you mean by sort of neighborhood? Like how is that sort of specifically defined in the data set? What's the unit that we're talking about?
Yes, I will talk a lot more about this, but basically we're talking about census enumeration blocks. So the enumeration block is the lowest spatial unit that the census uses when they go and collect information, and the population census basically creates maps of all of India every 10 years. And they try to divide them up into collections of about just under 1,000 people. And so we're going to use this unit for our purposes, the Socioeconomic and Caste Census, from which we have household microdata, and then the Economic Census, from which we have data on all economic establishments, and very importantly, on public schools and government health centers. Use the same 2011 population census enumeration blocks. And so we can basically match up the household data from the socioeconomic caste census to the economic census establishments, which we're using to measure the provision of public goods. And then we're going to do a little bit of aggregation, but we're going to leave this as disaggregated as possible. And at the very end, I'm going to show you kind of how some of our results change with the scale of aggregation that we use. And in particular, we aggregate a bit in order to compare to the US and to African Americans in the US. But the enumeration block is the kind of lowest that we can go here. They're not administrative units, but they are an attempt to carve out kind of somewhat coherent neighborhoods from each other.
Sam, can I ask a related question too?
Absolutely.
Segregation by domicile, or do you have other measures of interaction within communities?
Yeah, it's entirely by domicile. This is going to be about neighborhood composition. This is going to be about the share of people in the neighborhood that are from the Muslim community, the share of people in the neighborhood that are scheduled caste. We could do it by ownership of businesses, and we basically find very, very similar results there. Businesses tend to be in the neighborhoods in which people live often, and basically we find roughly the same results, but yes, this is very much residential segregation.
And
we don't have measures of where people shop, or kind of, some of the cutting edge work that's being done in places like the US on segregation of where people spend time during the day, and finding that like our spaces are very segregated, like the office and where we shop and things are very segregated in the United States. We're not going to have anything like that here.
And one more thing to keep you from getting to your next slide. You say scheduled castes. This caste system, I thought, was outlawed. Do they keep track of everybody?
The caste system is not outlawed. Untouchability is outlawed, which is the sort of most extreme form of discrimination against people at the bottom of the caste hierarchy. Caste governs people's lives in many, many different ways. Who they associate with, who they marry, often who they work with, where you live. So the caste system is a system of social organization in India. Let me talk about it when I talk about these two communities. But basically, scheduled castes are a collection of very different caste groups at the bottom of the caste hierarchy, who have traditionally been very severely discriminated against, and for whom the government has designed a series of different measures, affirmative action, reservations in government positions and in university seats. There are laws that punish violent crimes against scheduled castes more than against other groups. So there are a series of different measures that the government has tried to take to try to reverse some of these age-old inequalities. And one of the important features here is that that's not taking place for Muslims. And we think that helps to inform some of what we're finding. But we're definitely not in this paper going to be testing the impacts of any of these policies. That's more the context.
Thank you.
Sure. Any other questions for now? Okay. Cool. So, as I was saying, these marginalized, these neighborhoods with high proportions of people from these marginalized communities experience far worse access to public goods. This is more true for Muslims than for scheduled castes. This is much more than the more aggregated data would suggest. And we also find that the settlement and segregation patterns are unique. They're not the same as the United States, where people have studied segregation far more than pretty much the rest of the world combined. And so we find that actually, in contrast to the United States, all groups are poorer in more segregated neighborhoods or in more segregated cities, not just the minority groups, not just the marginalized groups. That's one example of where this is quite different from the United States, where the sort of major finding in one of the major findings in the segregation literature has been that in more segregated cities, African Americans are much worse off, but whites are not. Okay. So here's the context, and we've already talked a little bit about this. Scheduled castes and Muslims are both, scheduled castes are 17% of the population, Muslims are 14% of the population. This is not so far off from the proportion of the population in the United States that's Black. Scheduled castes, which are 17% of the population, are these officially designated groups of historically marginalized people. So they exist, actually they're often described at the bottom of the caste hierarchy, but actually many people consider them outside of the caste hierarchy entirely. But the caste system has repressed them for centuries, enforcing segregation at the level of occupation. Scheduled castes, like many other caste groups, have traditional occupations, and those traditional occupations have generally been the worst. Residential segregation, if you go into a typical Indian village, to the extent to which there is a typical Indian village, there will be different neighborhoods and the scheduled castes will live apart from the rest of the group, and social segregation as well. They've been considered ritually impure. People will often not share drinking water with them. There have been traditionally like violent retribution for the shadow of a scheduled caste touching an upper caste person. There are many, many examples of this. I don't have time to go into super deep into these issues, but very, very marginalized groups. But as I said, the government has had a wide series of protective arrangements and affirmative action policies over the last several decades in particular that have really tried to reverse some of these historic inequalities. Muslims, on the other hand, 14% of the population, slightly smaller. This is actually the second largest Muslim population after Indonesia. So despite the fact that many of India's Muslims were either carved out or kicked out in partition into what is now Pakistan and Bangladesh, at that time West Pakistan and East Pakistan, India still has an absolutely massive Muslim population. They tend to be more urban. 40% live in urban areas. And that should be a good thing because urban India has higher wages, higher living standards, and so on. But there's extensive evidence of large both economic and political disparities. Muslims tend to be poor. They tend to live in worse areas, as we're going to show. They tend to be less than proportionally represented at all levels of government, and both on the electoral side as well as in the bureaucracy. Now, one important thing here is that we are not going to be talking about scheduled tribes. So oftentimes when people talk about marginalized communities in India, they talk about scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, and sometimes they include Muslims. And one of the things we're kind of pushing for is that we should be focusing much more on Muslims than I think many people do. Scheduled tribes, which are 9% of the population, they're often referred to as the Adivasis, or the original inhabitants of India. These are indigenous groups that disproportionately live in remote rural areas. Very, very few of them live in urban areas. And since the focus in this paper is going to be on what's happening in urban India, and we have way too much going on as it is already, we're not going to be talking about scheduled tribes here, but rest assured that we do not think that they're any less important, and we will be studying issues of their segregation and access to public goods in the future. So I just wanted to touch quickly on the literature in the US. I only have an hour here, so I should probably move pretty fast through this, but the US literature on segregation is very, very advanced. People have been studying this for a long time. There's a widespread recognition that segregation is a major issue that affects the access to opportunity for Blacks in particular in the US. People have done a lot of work on the different causes of segregation, self-segregation by marginalized communities, collective exclusion, which means being pushed out by the dominant communities, as well as white flight and just sorting by the dominant communities into other areas. The US has this history of discriminatory laws like redlining and racial covenants that have kept out groups like Blacks and Jews and others. There's, maybe most closely related to the work that we're doing here is this Gann's 1982 book, where he studied ethnic enclaves, particularly in Boston's North End and West End, and sort of showing that ethnic enclaves, in this case Sicilian, recreated many features of rural life in the origin countries. And we think that that phenomenon is playing out in India. We understand both theoretically and empirically that these feedback loops can generate tipping points where groups with even a small degree of homophily, meaning that they want to be around their own type or group, can generate large levels of segregation. More recent, really careful econometric work has shown that the Great Migration of Blacks from the US South to the industrial cities of the North in search of economic opportunity led to white flight. Whites fled the areas that Blacks were moving into, increased segregation, but also police spending and push down intergenerational mobility. And the highest segregation places in the US are associated with both lower mobility, but also a range of other negative economic outcomes like low Black birth weight. In lower income countries, there's a lot less evidence on this. I should say that this is this work we think is speaking both to the kind of more qualitative literature in places like India on segregation, but also to some work, a lot of work that's been done on ethnic fractionalization. There's been a lot of work for a very long time on ethnic fractionalization. There's been much less quantitative work on segregation. I would argue largely because we haven't had the data. You need very, very high resolution data and comprehensive data to study it. So what do we know in India? In India, there's a mostly qualitative literature on Muslim ghettos, The Sutter Committee was an official government body that was convened to study the state of Muslims in India and found very widespread disparities and discrimination. Political scientists in particular have studied Muslim ghettos. There's this great book by Geyer, edited by Geyer and Jaffarlo, on a series of different more qualitative studies on Muslim segregation in various cities across India. The Sutter Committee did find that more Muslim villages have fewer public goods, but it was a very crude analysis, and it was very difficult to know at what level this is really taking place. It may just be driven by sort of regional differences in how many Muslims there are, for example, in the North versus South India. We do know that Muslims and low castes tend to live in broader regions that have lower access to public goods. But one of the things that we're going to be arguing in this paper and in a number of our other papers is that actually, you know, they weren't far from the first people to say it, public goods are not truly public goods, they're local goods, right? When you have a road that goes into a village, that's not a road that serves the whole district, it's a road that serves that village. And it doesn't really matter to people from other places whether there's a road or a school or whatever in this particular village. So your access to these things, whether it's a school or a health center or electricity or whatever, is actually very determined by exactly where you live and exactly where these things are. And that's why we think it's so important to study these phenomena at the highly local level. We do know that proximity to jobs and to networks are really important for the urban poor. There's this one paper studying segregation and violence in Ahmedabad, but for some reason that sort of literature never really took off. There has been a series of really important papers by Bharati et al. Studying segregation using the population census, using a combination of population census and and a sort of more specific census that was conducted in Karnataka alone. So they estimate high levels of segregation by both caste and religion in urban Karnataka. Karnataka is a state in South India. They find high levels of segregation by scheduled caste and scheduled tribe in 5 major cities. And sort of mixed results on village diversity and public goods provision. But the point here is that there's very little evidence on the association between a combination of exactly where these groups live, the public goods that they have access to, and their economic outcomes. And that we're going to be able to put these 3 together, and I think paint like a really rich picture here. I just wanted to show you guys a couple of photos. These are of urban neighborhoods. Historically, many cities actually were very specifically designed around distinct neighborhoods for distinct groups, distinct castes and religious communities and so on. And so here's an example of a pole in Ahmedabad. This is the largest city in Gujarat in West India, where Prime Minister Modi comes from. And each of these are sort of self-contained neighborhoods with caste homogeneity, at least by design, where a single caste would live in a single neighborhood. And they actually have gates like this one at the entrance to these self-contained neighborhoods to provide protection and exclusion for these particular caste groups. And so if something terrible were going on outside, you could actually close the gate and basically wall off the neighborhood and turn it into like a mini fortress within the broader city. The other part of the context that I think is worth mentioning before we dive into this is we have this other paper on intergenerational mobility, where we developed some new methods for studying intergenerational mobility using educational data across different communities, across time and across geography. And the big result in that paper, which we then dig into in the second half of that paper, is that while scheduled castes and scheduled tribes have actually been closing some of the mobility gaps with upper caste groups, Muslims are actually falling further and further behind. So India is growing overall, everyone's getting richer, everyone's getting more education, including the poor or the children of the poor. But the children of poor Muslims in rank terms are actually falling further and further behind. Not just upper caste groups, but also scheduled castes and even scheduled tribes, despite the fact that scheduled tribes tend to live in very remote areas that have much worse educational infrastructure than, say, the urban areas that Muslims are in. And I think this, this is just providing context for the paper that we're doing here, but I think that this speaks to the very, very local and specific nature of what determines access to opportunity and educational achievement. And we're hoping to shed some more light on what exactly those features are of the economic environment. in this paper. Okay, so as I said, studying segregation, studying neighborhoods requires really good data. And while we have far from perfect data, we think we have data that has a number of advantages over what people have had in the past. So what do you need to study segregation? You need really high spatial resolution. You need to know exactly where people live. And if you're studying neighborhoods, you need to know the exact neighborhood that they're in, and it's not good enough to have the ward that people live in. A ward in an Indian city like Delhi can be like, 500,000 people. So we want to get much more local. So we're going to have neighborhood level data. We need community identified microdata. We need to know that Adam is from community X and Austin is from community Y. We need economic outcomes, and we need public goods provision. So that's what we're going to have here. First, we're going to be using the Socioeconomic Caste Census. So as a follow-up to the 2011 population census, which the Indian government does every 10 years, they conducted the Socioeconomic Caste Census in 2012. And it covers every single household and individual in India. And as I mentioned already, it's geographically identified down to the enumeration block level. So these are about 100 to 125, 150 households. We're in the process of geotagging these for a few cities, but what's important right now is that we just know that these are distinct units. So we don't necessarily know exactly where they all are within the cities, but we know that enumeration block 1 is different from enumeration block 2, and we also know that enumeration block 1 is next to enumeration block 2, because that's the way they did the ordering. And that allows us to aggregate into slightly larger units when we want to do that. The Socioeconomic Caste Census, it goes to every single household in the country. They collected a bunch of demographic data, age, we actually have names, and that's how we're going to categorize religion, but name, age, educational level, marital status, disability, which we don't use here, and then a range of different assets. And what we're going to do is we're going to impute consumption using a methodology called small area estimation. Now, there are a number of different ways that you can take a range of different assets or other measures of socioeconomic status and combine them into a single measure. What's nice about small area estimation, and we've been using it for a number of our other papers, for example, our work on rural roads, is that it's combining it into a single rupee value, which is our best guess of the consumption per capita of the household. Okay, and basically what we do is we take a different data set, in this case, the Indian Human Development Survey, which has consumption and has all the variables that we have in this survey, which is lacking consumption, and we regress consumption on all of these variables. And we get a number for a coefficient for each of the different variables that says when you have a four-wheeler, that is on average associated with this much more consumption. When you have a thatched roof, that's associated with this much less consumption on average, right? And we combine all of those using the information that we have on the assets in the socioeconomic and caste census into a single best guess of what is the consumption of the household. So that's what we're going to use for living standards. In the economic census, which was conducted 1 year later in 2013, this covers every single economic establishment in India. And what we mean by economic establishment is every non-farm establishment of any sort. So that can be public or private, that can be formal or informal, manufacturing or services. And so what we're going to use it for here is to look at mostly public facilities. We're starting to look at the private facilities of health and education. That's where we can measure what is the government doing in your neighborhood. Okay, does your neighborhood have a school? Does it have a primary school? Does it have a secondary school? Does your neighborhood have a public health facility? And we want to look at disparities in the government provision of these particular facilities at that same enumeration block level. Then we're going to have some data from the population census on demographics and on amenities at the whole city level. And then to make the US comparison, which we're going to make at one point, we're going to use the diversities and disparities and the ACS, which are those kind of standard surveys that are used to look at segregation in the US. Any questions on data? No. So I have,
Sam,
yeah, Adam, come on in.
Yeah, just a quick question. I think this, and it's probably going to be more relevant for, moving from a more descriptive paper to something that's, explaining variation and access to public goods and services. But I'm sort of wondering your thoughts on how there's probably a misalignment between sort of these census blocks and what is socially understood as a neighborhood. And as you know very well, these neighborhoods, in middle class areas, they'll be gated, very strong identification with the neighborhood. These are the units with which people will mobilize and bargain with politicians to get things. And so I'm assuming that, the census blocks are not going to sort of be perfectly nested within, what would be socially understood as a neighborhood. But obviously that's going to be, a different question than when you look at municipal wards or assembly constituencies. But yeah, I'm just sort of curious what your thoughts are on that. I'm not sure exactly what the way to go about finding those out, other than looking at town plans. The town planning offices of any one city would actually have sort of named neighborhoods.
Yeah.
But I don't know, you guys are doing magical things with big data in India, so I wouldn't put it past you guys to figure that out too. But yeah, just sort of curious what your thoughts are on how this sort of aligns to social understandings of neighborhoods, how people move in and out of them, and those as sort of political and spatial, social and spatial units.
Totally. Yeah. No, that's a great question. So a couple thoughts on that. First of all, I'm not sure we're doing magical work. I think we're doing tedious work and sometimes informative work. But so these enumeration blocks, they do make an attempt to kind of keep them sort of within neighborhoods. So you'll see, and we actually have data for I said that we're in the process of geocoding these enumeration blocks for a handful of different cities. For Mumbai, for Delhi, for Calcutta as part of some other work that I'm doing with the World Bank. And we actually, for the ones where we've gotten the enumeration block lists, we actually know the name of the enumeration block. So it says, like, in Delhi, it says Defense Colony 1, Defense Colony 2, Defense Colony 3. And so we have a whole bunch of enumeration blocks, all of which are within Defense Colony. So one thing we can do as sort of I think an interesting test is to try to aggregate up to like sort of the name of the broader colony. As Adam says, in India, these colonies are often extremely important. They often provide both technically public and private goods. They're little clubs, they exclude outsiders. There's just fascinating dynamics going on at this neighborhood level and many people studying them. And it may be that we have some measurement error here by using these slightly more arbitrary enumeration blocks and maybe the wrong size. So I won't speak to that too much today, other than to say I think that in the future we can use the names of these neighborhoods to see whether we get how the results change when we aggregate up to those levels. I will show you at least a partial step towards that by seeing how, for example, Muslim share predicts lower levels, how Muslim segregation changes as you get into bigger and bigger neighborhoods. Now, these neighborhoods are going to be grouped somewhat arbitrarily because they're just based on what you're next to, rather than like, these are all called defense colony. So it's only a small step in that direction. But I think your question reminds me that for this next draft of the paper, we should at least have that result, because we can just for those few cities take those names and define the neighborhoods that way. I think what we're seeing based on these sort of semi-arbitrary enumeration block drawings, and then based on the much more arbitrary process of agglomerating neighboring enumeration blocks, we're seeing still quite high levels of segregation. We're seeing that those larger groupings still predict much lower levels of public goods. So, I think if anything, like our mismeasurement is leading us to underestimate the importance of these dynamics. Yeah.
And it just, based on my limited experience in Delhi, it would seem like your enumeration block sizes have got to be considerably smaller than colony sizes by and large, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are some colonies that are super, super small. There's a little tiny slum on the side of, some richer neighborhood or something like that. So they can be very small, but yes, our neighborhoods are, I think, smaller on average than self-defined colonies. But even self-defined colonies often will have blocks within them that provide different goods to their residents and so on. But yes, I think that's why I think we're very interested in this scale issue. It's been well known for a long time that segregation varies by scale. Almost every household in India is fully segregated, right? A household is generally all Muslim or all non-Muslim. But as you go up, that's gonna change. And so I'll show you those results at the end. So just to be clear, I have until half past. Yeah. Okay.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, great. So I should pick it up, but I can't give this talk without giving a little plug for some of the open data work that we're doing. So as I mentioned, Paul and I started this organization, Development Data Lab, which is one part our sort of research lab, but is one part open science organization. And one of the main things we've done is create a series of different open data platforms that we have been very gratified to see a lot of people using. And in particular, the main one we're working on a second version of it right now, excuse me, is the SHRUG, the Socioeconomic High Resolution Rural Urban Geographic Data Platform for India. And this is basically covering every village and town in the entire country, and with data covering a 30-year period. So this includes satellite imagery, estimates of agricultural yields, nightlights, deforestation. We have this estimate of consumption that I described to you, demographics. And the important thing here is that we found a way of creating these stable geographic units so that you can really study the same villages over time, over this 30-year period across census rounds, where the codes change, across data sets where the codes don't match at all. And the basic idea here is that, like, investments in data should happen once, and then it should be a public good for everyone. Like, really trying to make data the non-rival resource that theoretically it is. But of course, we all know it's not. And so this is our best effort at that, and we're working on a new version of it that we hope is even more useful. But a lot of people are using this for their research, and that's been really nice to see. And please do check it out if you think it might be useful for yours. So since I'm picking up the pace, let me just say that we use an LSTM machine learning model to classify names as Muslim. We have training data from the National Railway exam that lists the religion and name for 1.4 million National Railway exam takers across the country. And we basically find over 95% accuracy with our classifier. So we think we're doing a really good job of classifying households. We're classifying whole households actually rather than individuals to try to improve our signal a bit, leveraging the fact that in India there's basically no intermarriage. But in the future, we hope to do work on like the sort of bleeding edge of some limited intermarriage using these names. But for now, we're classifying households, and then we're coming up with a measure for the whole neighborhood of what share of the population is Muslim. In the Socioeconomic Caste Census, it actually says whether a household is scheduled caste or not. And so we have that directly from the data. The classification just is for Muslims. And we're working on using these methods and refining them to try to get down to the caste level. This is going to be really important for some future work that we're doing on different jatis in India, different like subcastes and endogamous communities. But for now, we're just focused on Muslim versus non-Muslim.
Could I ask a quick question on that? This is probably going to reflect my ignorance of the Indian context more than anything, but I'm open and willing to learn. Is there any intersection here? Are Muslims also scheduled caste?
Very, very rarely.
Yeah, talking about them as distinct groups, and so I'm trying to understand whether they overlap at all.
They are basically distinct groups. There's like 2% overlap between them, and so what we do is when there's overlap, we just call them scheduled caste and move on, because it doesn't really make a difference. Like, we've done a little bit of robustness, saying like, what if we classify scheduled caste Muslims as scheduled caste versus Muslim? Does it change anything? But because it's so exceedingly rare, it doesn't.
Muslims some other caste in the system?
That's a great question.
Sorry.
That is a really wonderful question. So caste is, people have made the point that caste is a sort of South Asian phenomenon and not just a Hindu phenomenon. It has its roots in Hindu scriptures, but the fact is that many other religions which don't technically have caste or even explicitly reject caste actually organize themselves into what should be understood as caste units. So endogamous communities that kind of rank themselves and have many features of these caste groups. So what I want you to think of, so we're lumping all that together for Muslims. We're also lumping together lots of different distinct castes into the scheduled caste category. The scheduled caste category is a category of many different jatis, many different subcastes, each of which is endogamous, each of which has their own traditions and traditional occupations and so on. But these are broad categories of people who are generally mistreated by the rest of the population and seen as other, and that's the category that we're going to be using. So just like, you know, in the US, there are distinct communities within the African American community, there are distinct sub-communities within Jewish community or others, but these are very distinct communities often within these broader groupings because they are endogamous. They do only marry their own members of their own groups, but they're often lumped together for policymaking purposes as well as for kind of in social constructions of broader categories, and so that's what we're going to be using here. I'm not going to show you too much on segregation per se. We're mostly going to be focused on neighborhoods. But when we are talking about segregation, we're talking about this measure of dissimilarity, this index of dissimilarity, which is basically saying there are many, many different measures of segregation. They're all one version or another of inequality measures, just like there are many ways of measuring income inequality. This is probably the most popular one in the literature, but it's so highly correlated with all these other measures that we just use this one. And it basically says how unevenly distributed across some larger unit are Muslims across neighborhoods. So let's take a city that's 15% Muslim. If there's an index of dissimilarity of 0, if there's no segregation, then every single neighborhood is 15% Muslim. If on the other hand, Muslims are entirely, you know, every neighborhood is either 100% Muslim or 0% Muslim, that's going to be an index of dissimilarity of 1. Saying they're perfectly unevenly distributed. They're totally segregated into very specific neighborhoods. And so we're going to do that at the neighborhood level. So comparing neighborhoods to this larger unit, which is going to be in the case of urban areas, cities, and in the case of rural areas, subdistricts, of which there are about as many as there are cities in India. So I should pick up the pace since we only have 15 minutes, but basically our main we're mostly going to look at enumeration blocks, which we call this measure 200, which says if you're an enumeration block of less than 200, I'm going to, if I can, lump you in with the enumeration block next door to create slightly larger units so that we don't have like a whole bunch of really, really tiny units. And what you can see here on the left is that the urban and rural distributions are very similar, so we can kind of make what we think are valid comparisons between the outcomes for urban and rural areas. On the other hand, we have this 4,000 grouping, which is much more similar to the US with the census tracts, which are generally have populations of about 4,000. But what you can see is we generally can't do that for rural areas because we didn't want to aggregate across villages, and rural villages are almost all much smaller than 4,000. Don't worry too much about this right now. I've already talked about measuring consumption. This is the small area estimation. For access to public goods, we're going to have 3 different measures of public goods coming from this economic census. We're going to have education facilities, which are primary and secondary, using these industrial codes, which we have for every establishment, and the fact that they're publicly provided. So we're really focused on, is the government equally providing primary schools, secondary schools, and health centers? We're throwing out for the time being the private provision data, but we're starting to use that now, and I'll talk about it at the end. And for health, we're lumping together all these different categories of government health facilities: inpatient, outpatient, and other. But not surprisingly, most of it is outpatient, small government clinics. For outcome variables, we're going to look at a binary measure of, is there a health center in this neighborhood or not? We're going to look at a measure of how much is there, which is the log of employment in these facilities plus 1. And on the right-hand side, we're also going to look at the very end at the share of marginalized groups in say a city that are living in neighborhoods that actually have these public goods. Okay, so first, our main specifications, because we're mostly focused on these neighborhoods, is going to be to say, how do outcome, whatever outcome Y, let's say a binary variable for the presence of a health center, how does that vary as a function of the share of the neighborhood that is from scheduled castes and the share of the neighborhood that is Muslim? And then we're going to have some controls at the city level or at the rural subdistrict level. These are going to be fixed effects that just take out the averages, because we're mostly focused on how do these outcomes vary across neighborhoods within the same area. And we'll also control for just the total population of the enumeration block. since obviously bigger enumeration blocks are just covering more people, covering more area, and are more likely to have these things. And we're going to do this separately for rural and urban areas. Okay, so let's first get into rural segregation. We're going to say, like, there's this huge, mostly qualitative literature on how segregated rural India is by caste and by religion, but less so, both across and within villages. So first we're going to say, okay, let's take it to the data and say how quantitatively how segregated are India's rural areas and how does this affect access to public goods and living standards. And we're going to establish a few basic facts. One is that there's a very high degree of segregation, though this varies somewhat by scale. The second is that disparities in public good access are really predicted by the share of the local population that belongs to these marginalized groups, but particularly so for Muslims. High Muslim areas are getting many fewer schools and health facilities. And living standards also are highly predicted by local marginalized group share. So being a Muslim is really, in general, Muslims are poorer than non-Muslims, but you're much poorer than others when you actually are in high marginalized group areas. But actually everyone's, actually in the case of rural areas, the non-Muslims are going to be actually a bit richer in highly Muslim areas. I'll show you that in a second. I'm going to go ahead. So here's the extent of segregation. This is kind of hard to read off a graph and say how big this is, but basically these are very high degrees of segregation. I'm showing this separately for these smaller neighborhood groupings, EB 200, and then trying to aggregate up to bigger units on the right-hand side. Basically, the right-hand side one is saying segregation across villages rather than neighborhoods within villages. And what you can see here is just high levels of segregation. I'll show you at the end, like comparing this to US Blacks, but also that segregation shifts a bit to the left when you aggregate to a higher level. So segregation is a highly local phenomenon, particularly for scheduled castes. They're in like their different small neighborhoods, often within villages. What you can see here, so here's a bin scatter where on the x-axis is the share of the population that belongs to these different groups. And on the y-axis is the likelihood, the probability of having a primary school in these particular figures. And what you can see is that actually for primary schools, there's not that much variation as a function of scheduled caste share. So actually it goes up a little bit with more scheduled castes and then goes down a bit for an average of not that different. But what you can see on the right-hand side is that as areas get more Muslim, they are much, much less likely to have a primary school in their neighborhood. Now, another way of seeing this is from that regression that I told you about, where we regress, say, presence of having a primary school on the share of the local population that's Muslim and the share of the local population that's scheduled caste. And what you can see here is while scheduled caste areas are slightly less likely in rural areas to have primary schools and a little bit less likely to have secondary schools, no big difference in health centers. Those are all these blue coefficients. For Muslims, you can just see really, really big disparities. Muslim areas are much less likely to have primary schools, much less likely to have secondary schools, and less likely to have health facilities. And one thing I should point out here is that these coefficients shouldn't really be compared across these different categories, because in general, there are far fewer secondary schools than there are primary schools. I think it would be helpful in the future. We're going to scale these by the means. But basically, if I go here,
Sam?
Yeah, Austin.
Oh, I'm sorry to interrupt. I was wondering if you could speak to, do you have any idea of how this affects enrollment and attainment?
Yeah, so we're just getting into that a little bit right now. We're not great at matching enrollment to like the super local neighborhood level. We could kind of do it at the village level, but what we can do is just look at the attainment for children in each of these neighborhoods, right? And it's just one of our next steps. It looks like, we've started doing this just a little bit. Yeah, the absence of these schools does seem to predict like pretty big gaps in attainment.
Great, thanks.
This relates to another thing that we're kind of looking at right now. We're all trying to do this kind of in conjunction, which is looking at private provision. So what we're basically, to give a preview since I'm going to completely run out of time. What we're finding is that particularly rich Muslim areas are making up for some of the lack of public provision with private provision. And so the gaps in overall school presence are not as big as those in public because people are paying for it themselves, it seems. And we're trying to get into what's the relationship between public provision, private provision, and the ultimate educational attainment of the children in those areas.
Is it possible to ask if the private school that is being put into the Muslim area is keeping out public education? Is the public, are they saying we don't need, as they do in some other countries, we don't need the public ones, we have our own private ones?
So that seems unlikely. The government is supposed to provide schools to all areas, and this is supposed to be taking place at a higher level of administration. So this isn't supposed to be something that people have to request. Of course, there are complicated political negotiations taking place that Adam could tell you a lot more about than I could. And so one of the challenges here is how to sort of interpret this two-way relationship between, say, public and private provision. We, based on our reading of the broader literature and talking to people, we mostly think it goes in the direction of government decides where to provide things, and then people kind of make up for stuff with private provision. But of course, that's an oversimplification. I'm sure occasionally it goes in the other direction. One thing that I should mention here, people ask a lot that's related to this question is, people ask a lot about Muslim religious schools and madrasas. It's just sort of a non-story. It's a big deal in Indonesia. In India, like 2% of Muslim kids are going to madrasas. So it's just a thing that comes up over and over again, and I have to kind of shoot down over and over again and saying that's not the story here.
Dr. Asher?
Yeah.
Right, just before the time ends. Can you say a little bit about what you found the most surprising in your findings? Is there a city where the replication of rural disparity is less, or it actually goes the other way, or something like that?
Yeah. So yes, especially since I'm running out of time, that's a great question. Let me do this. Let me answer that. Can I go a couple minutes over? Is that, like, I understand that some people are going to have to go, but
yeah, but I think is good. Sorry.
Yeah, we let you. Oh, sorry to interrupt. Yeah, we had you start a little late, so please. Yeah, but everyone should feel free to continue with their schedules if they need to. But I'll certainly, I'm interested to wait around.
Awesome. So let me get through this, and let me just say, Manaswini, quickly to your point that we haven't looked at because we're trying to do this for all India and establish these broad patterns. We haven't gone very deep into the sort of this city versus that specific city, though I think there's a lot of fruitful work to do there, and we're actually exploring a partnership with the Hindustan Times to do kind of data journalism based on this work and a number of other projects of ours, where there's just so much data, there's so much to be learned at the much more local level, and we don't have the time or capacity to get into those things. But I will say, I guess we were very struck by the fact that segregation levels are actually much higher for scheduled castes, even in urban areas, than for Muslims, but that segregation, those differences in neighborhood composition are much more consequential for Muslims. So it's the Muslim areas that are being neglected much more than the scheduled caste areas, even those scheduled caste areas that you'll find more kind of really high share scheduled caste areas than you will Muslim areas, which was actually very striking to us, because I think a lot of people's priors are with these Muslim ghettos, and people have spent time in, whether it's Nizamuddin in Delhi or like other neighborhoods in Bombay or whatever it is. I think that's very salient to people, but actually Muslim segregation is considerably less than scheduled caste. But the governments are really providing much lower levels, as we can see in this figure, for example, of public goods in the Muslim areas as opposed to in the scheduled caste areas. So that was I think that's the kind of major takeaway that I want here, and everything else is sort of supporting that big story. Okay, let me just say consumption is lower for scheduled castes than Muslims. That's not terribly surprising compared to others who are these light brown dots. But that, like, the sort of negative gradient is particularly strong for scheduled castes and Muslims. If you look at consumption, actually, so like scheduled castes are poor, scheduled castes and Muslims are poorer in scheduled caste and Muslim areas. Others are actually richer in those same areas. I think this is something that we're not going to be able to explain very well in this paper, but I think is like a really important finding that I hope other work can kind of get into in the future. Whether this is because, you know, these high scheduled caste areas have like sort of large landowners belonging to the other communities who kind of benefit from their either assets or their bargaining power with these marginalized groups or what. I think there's a lot more that needs to be done here. And this is actually a result that's different in rural and urban areas. Let me get to the urban areas though, because I set up this whole paper as like, are these things happening in urban areas? And I haven't told you a damn thing about urban areas, and it's already half past. So the basic answer is yes, these patterns are being repeated in urban areas with some differences. Let me show you what we have, and let me show you a little bit on causes, but I should say, you know, because I think people are really interested in what's driving this. When we have only a single cross section here, there's only so much we can say about the long run causes. But let me show you what we do have. So here's the extent of segregation in urban areas. We put the rural areas smaller on the left. So again, scheduled castes are more segregated than Muslims in urban areas. If you look on the bottom, which is with the 4,000 level aggregation, which is basically neighborhoods in India that are of the same size as census tracts in the US, you see that scheduled castes are actually about as segregated as US blacks, which is to say very segregated. Muslims are less segregated than both of these groups, though still quite segregated. What you can see here is more, this is for secondary schools, just to take an example. More scheduled caste areas, particularly the very scheduled caste areas in urban areas are less likely to have a secondary school. The pattern holds very, very strongly across the distribution for Muslims as well. And these differences are big. So this is taking out fixed effects for the city. This is controlling for even the scheduled caste share. And what you can see here is that a neighborhood that has no Muslims has about like a 2.5% chance of having a secondary school. And that basically gets cut almost in half when you go up to a neighborhood that's entirely Muslim. So these are really, really big differences. That you saw the figure on the left for rural areas, so just focus on the figure on the right for urban areas. The coefficients are smaller because in general, urban neighborhoods are less likely than villages to have a number of these public goods. When they're close by an urban neighborhood, you know, people in one urban neighborhood can go to the health center in the neighboring one, and so they don't bother putting a health center in every single urban neighborhood. There are certain economies of scale. But what you can see here is really consistent patterns where actually primary schools, scheduled caste neighborhoods have more primary schools on average, but for secondary schools and for health facilities, both groups have bigger disparities for Muslims than for scheduled castes, despite, as I said, the lower levels of segregation. Same basic patterns here, except for the fact that basically in high scheduled caste neighborhoods, and on the next slide on high Muslim neighborhoods, everyone is poorer, but the ranking is very, very clear. Upper castes are richer, or other groups are richer than SCs, who are actually richer than Muslims. This is another really striking result that we find. People often talk about scheduled castes as being the poorest. Actually, in many circumstances, we're finding that Muslims are behind both other groups in both educational attainment and in terms of consumption. Here are the consumption coefficient plots that I promised. So we think that this is always tricky to interpret because there's a certain amount of sorting, but basically scheduled castes and Muslims are considerably poorer when they're in neighborhoods with many of their co-ethnics. And this holds, I should say, even after controlling for education. So this is not just about sort of the poor scheduled castes, the lowest education scheduled castes sorting into highly scheduled caste neighborhoods, whereas richer ones can go and live with richer members of other groups. When you control for education, and we can control very flexibly for education, you still find that people are much poorer when they're surrounded by a number of their, like a high number of their co-ethnics. We then are interested in this over time. So we show that at least at the village level where we can measure it, these shares are very, very stable over time. Scheduled caste share in 1991 is highly predictive, like 0.95% correlation with scheduled caste share in the following census in 2001 and the following census after that in 2011. And what you can basically see here, so we're using the current numbers because these are so highly correlated of Muslims and of scheduled castes, but we're looking at provision of government schools for primary schools, secondary schools, and then for these health facilities from 1991, from 2001, and from 2011. And what you can see here is that actually focus on the secondary schools. While scheduled caste areas, scheduled caste villages are actually at less of a disadvantage by 2011 than they were compared to 1991, the disadvantages are actually getting worse for Muslims. So basically a ton of secondary schools have been built between 1991 and 2011, and they are very, very disproportionately going to areas that are not Muslim, okay? And they're slightly advantageously selected into areas that are scheduled caste. You can see, on the other hand, for health facilities, this is another area that I think is deserving of a lot of future work. There have been a lot of policies aimed at trying to close gaps in educational attainment and educational access between scheduled castes and non-scheduled castes. And you see some catching up by scheduled castes in that regard here in terms of infrastructure and in other work we have in terms of educational attainment. In health, where there's been much less of an emphasis on helping scheduled castes catch up, health facilities are more and more unevenly distributed. Being in a highly scheduled caste or in a highly Muslim neighborhood is increasingly predictive of not having a health facility relative to other areas. Okay, since I'm out of time, let me just show you a couple more things. One thing is that because we think that there's a lot of path dependence in this, we think that patterns set down by cities a very long time ago are highly predictive of where people live today and potentially the access that they have to, say, public goods. We look at city level segregation over time, and we can't look at this actually over time. Like, we can't see the same city in 1900 and in 2000. But what we can do is look at the age of the city. And we can do this because we know when basically this place became considered urban. So when did this kind of take off as an urban area, basically crossing the 5,000 population threshold. And what you can see here is that based on the year that the town first appeared as a town, the younger towns, even controlling for the size of the town, the younger towns are less segregated, both in terms of caste on the left and in terms of religion on the right. So that's somewhat encouraging that the younger places, the newer places, are less segregated than the old. However, if you look at the slopes, you'll see that, you know, Indian cities founded sometime after the year 3000 are going to be relatively unsegregated. The other thing I'll show is that even controlling for city age, the larger cities are actually more segregated than the smaller cities. So we think in some ways the larger cities are more anonymous. In some ways there might be greater equality of opportunity, but actually we also think there are these scale effects where the larger cities allow for more self-sorting than perhaps smaller cities do. Everyone is poorer in more segregated areas. As I said, this is different from the US, where whites tend not to be poorer in cities that are more or less segregated. It's blacks that are poorer in the more segregated cities. In India, we find that everyone is poorer in the more segregated cities. This is not a causal claim. It could be going in either direction. There could be something driving both of these. To sort of in some ways, the most direct evidence that we have about is rural segregation being reproduced in urban areas is to look at the correlation between segregation in rural areas in a district versus segregation in urban areas in that same district. And what we basically find is that they're very, very highly correlated. So I need to have my research assistant flip these axes. But basically what we're finding is this very, very strong relationship between rural segregation and nearby urban segregation. This is a highly local phenomenon. We find much higher levels of segregation at small neighborhood sizes than we do at large neighborhood sizes. So on the x-axis here is the grouping. How much are we putting together neighborhoods of different sizes, like trying to combine larger neighborhoods? And what you can see on the right, focus on that for a minute, is urban dissimilarity. Urban segregation levels are on the y-axis. The amount of aggregation that we're doing of neighborhoods, basically the average neighborhood size in this in this estimation of segregation. And what we're finding is that segregation levels are much higher when we are looking at the smallest unit of neighborhoods. As we aggregate neighborhoods to larger and larger sizes, segregation falls. And just take a look at the 4,000 for a moment. That's where we can compare to US Blacks. And basically what we're finding is that scheduled castes are somewhat more segregated than US Blacks, a little bit, not too far off. Muslims are less segregated than US Blacks on average. But I think the big result there is really about how much segregation is a highly, highly local phenomenon and how much it drops as we aggregate more and more. So what are we doing as next steps? First, as I mentioned, we're looking at private provision and whether that's compensating for the inequalities in public amenities that we observe at the neighborhood level. Our preliminary results are suggesting that Muslim neighborhoods in particular, remember, these are the ones that are receiving the fewest public goods, seem to be compensating for public under provision with increased private schools and private health centers. But these effects really vary by income quartile. One of the nice things about having the microdata is that we can cut this up in all kinds of different ways. And what we're finding is that the poorest neighborhoods actually end up with the largest total discrepancies because actually there's not that much difference in public provision across poor and rich Muslim neighborhoods, but the rich Muslim neighborhoods are making up for it with more private provision. Whereas the public area, the poorest areas have low public provision and not so much private provision. One thing we're kind of thinking about doing, but probably won't make it into this paper, is looking at spatial mismatch and how segregation ends up potentially pushing these marginalized groups into areas that are far from jobs. And as I said, we're doing more on this issue of neighborhood size. So to conclude, I hope I've convinced you that segregation is really important and that it's greatly understudied in low-income countries. Rural areas in India have been understood to be very segregated for centuries. Are these inequalities being replicated in India's booming cities? Yes, yes, they are. So what we're doing in this paper is establishing basic facts about both rural and urban segregation and showing how much urban areas, even the relatively young ones, are highly segregated and how consequential that is for the level of access to public goods and for living standards. Even though scheduled castes are more segregated, Muslims are faring far worse than scheduled castes in many dimensions. And in particular, the Muslims who are in highly Muslim areas are getting much less access to public goods and have much lower living standards. And we hope that this is the beginning. We're trying to write a series of descriptive papers on various issues that we think our data really speak to, and that we and many others think are first order issues in India and in other lower and middle income countries and rich countries for that matter. But here we're hoping in particular to do a number of different follow-on papers. One of them is on the rise of the BJP. All of these data actually come from before the Modi government comes into power. And so these are really, when we're looking at these long run disparities, these are really the accumulated effects of many, many decades of discrimination or of unequal provision. But we are interested in whether these big disparities that we're seeing for Muslims are the results of different BJP governments at the local level, whether the rise of the Hindu nationalist political movement explains some of these Muslim disparities. The relationship between violence and segregation. Segregation can be both a cause of and a consequence of violence. And so trying to get a little bit of traction there. Discrimination in housing markets is something that is talked about a ton, but has generally proven quite difficult to study quantitatively. And finally, I should just mention that we're putting together very, very rich anthropological data on the sort of social norms and cultural customs of 5,000 different communities in India. So these would be different, basically caste groups or communities within these other religious communities. And the British in around 1900 and the Indian government around 1990 collected just a huge wealth of information on the various norms of these groups, including a lot of norms against mixing with other groups. And so trying to understand the extent to which these longstanding historical cultural norms of these groups may be driving some of the patterns of segregation and inequality that we're observing in the data. So sorry for going over time. Thanks so much for your attention, and really looking forward to any further thoughts that you have.
Thank you, Sam, for sharing some really fascinating work, and the agenda you outlined for us just now is really compelling. I think I speak for all of us when I say we look forward to hearing more about it. So let me just open the floor briefly if there are any final questions for Sam. Otherwise, we'll wrap up, and I'm sure that I mean I plan to follow up with Sam, and I'm sure he'd be open to hearing from others as well. So
absolutely.
Yeah, I have a question, Sam, if I may. I like your, first of all, fascinating work. Your result that all groups are poor in more segregated neighborhoods. And you did point out that causality is yet to be determined, although we have a prior on that. But another thought I had was more of a macroeconomic look, and to see whether segregated neighborhoods or villages exhibit lower growth rates. So something about being segregated is pulling things down. And I know there might be some data constraints, but you know, I'm just having some prior thoughts that highly segregated places, probably with low human capital, aren't growing as fast. And who knows, on the other hand, maybe they depress wages, and do they attract foreign direct investment to employ, you know, so I'm just, I know this is going a little bit different from your micro perspective, but I also just was thinking a lot of the macro aspects.
Yeah. I mean, I think probably these segregated neighborhoods are much less well poised to take advantage of the quite rapid growth that's taking place in India, because the new jobs that are popping up are being distributed through networks, and when you're sort of fully separated. Sorry for the ringing out there. In Mexico, they collect trash by parking trucks outside of houses and ringing their bells until you give them your trash and money with it. So I think we're gonna have trouble studying things like FDI at the neighborhood level, though of course, if you have any data on that, I would love to get my hands on it. I think that the one thing that we could do is look at education by cohort. You know, there's a lot of people use one round of educational data to be able to look back in time, because of course education is fixed in childhood or at the end of childhood. And so we could kind of see whether these more segregated neighborhoods are sort of, as Indian education takes off, is that where their sort of disparities are opening up. There's been just massive construction of primary and more recently secondary schools in India. So we could actually kind of, in some sense, look back in time, treating these households as sort of fixed in place going back. But yeah, I love the question, and we'll think more about how we can get more into, look more at the time series. I mean, that's our big constraint here, is that we have this single cross section of both households and establishments, and there's only so much we can say about the past. Right? It's much more here's a snapshot. Here are things that we haven't really known. Here's a new set of facts that hopefully other people can say a whole, or us in future work can say a whole lot more about.
great. Any other questions or feedback for Sam? All right. Well, I'm going to close the meeting now, but again, I'd like to give Sam a virtual round of applause here, and thank you very much for joining us today. And I'll look forward to catching up with you soon, as I'm sure will others. So thanks a lot.
All right. Thanks so much, everyone.